advantage of that. With that being said, let me introduce you to what I think is a fantastic panel who are made up not only of presenters at this year's DevOps Enterprise Summit, but I think each one of these folks have presented at previous DevOps Enterprise Summits as well. First, let me introduce you to Dr. Nicole Forskren. Nicole is the CEO and Chief Scientist at DevOps Research and Assessment, or DORA, as some may call it. But beyond that, Dr. Nicole has been an instrumental person in the DevOps surveys put on by Puppet and Gene and others over the years in the analysis of that and publishing the results. She has been actually very involved in a lot of what's going on in DevOps. And Nicole, thank you so much for joining us today.
Sure, thanks so much for having me.
Great. Next is Sam Guggenheimer. Sam is with Microsoft, where he's the product owner for Microsoft Visual Studio Cloud Services, and you could read that on the slides. More importantly, Sam sort of led the transformation at Microsoft's Visual Studio, moving it from a sort of traditional application to cloud-based, and as such, had first-hand knowledge on leading a DevOps transformation. Sam also wrote a great paper, and I've interviewed him on the past on 7 habits of DevOps, and I probably messed that title up. But Sam, welcome.
Thank you very much, Alan. Great talking to you again.
Sam, what was it? The 7 habits, successful habits of DevOps, or?
Yeah. So that paper is at aka.ms/DevOps.
Great. Next is another DevOps veteran, J. Paul Reed. Paul, managing partner at Release Engineering Approaches, and Paul has been, in the trenches, leading transformations and working with clients for years and years. Worked at companies, as we see here, at VMware, Mozilla, Symantec, etc. Paul, welcome to today's webinar. Thank you for attending.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
Fantastic. And then last but not least, we're happy to have Scott Peru, who's Chief Architect and VP of Software Development at CSG International. Scott, I'm not as familiar with your DevOps story as I am with the other 3. But
thanks for having me. You'll hear a lot about it today, but then also at DES.
Absolutely, and we are looking forward to that. So guys, that actually served as our sound check as well. Everyone seems to be working good. Let's jump into our next slide. As I mentioned, this year Gene and the Speakers Committee really had 4 or 5 themes that they were seeking to kind of peel the onion back a little bit, the layers of the onion back, and do a deep dive on. And we're going to hit each of these themes today in a conversational way. And again, audience, please feel free to pop your questions in there based upon this when you hear it. So the first theme that we're going to hit on is organizational design. And I think before we dive into the questions, would anyone like to kind of set the stage of what we mean by organizational design in regard or relation to DevOps? Nicole,
I'd be happy to.
Okay, Sam, is that you? Go ahead.
Sure. So the classic issue is that organizations in the past have suffered from tremendous silos that have kept people from working together. The Agile transformation made this point about development teams, and then the DevOps transformations made this about development and ops. That's issue number 1, not getting caught into functional silos. Issue number 2, and actually Scott has some great stuff about this, is the inevitable factor of Conway's law, that as you scale an organization, you get boundaries in the organization that determine the nature of the software you ship. Therefore, you want to flip on its head the idea of having an existing organizational structure work on whatever software you're going to do, to say, I want to redesign the org based on the software I want to deliver so that it fits functionally with how you see the value going to market.
Excellent.
I think we have this additional issue sometimes where we can have this, massive amount of bloat, right? Where you end up introducing so many additional layers of management. Or, people ask, like, what's the best way to organize teams and what should the structure look like? What should the management structure look like? How many layers should I have? What's the best way to organize? And so, these are some of the questions that we end up getting. And I'm sure that so many of my panelists right now are like smiling and nodding because I know so many times we go to conferences and people say, what's the best way to organize? What's the best way to structure my organization for DevOps?
Absolutely. But interestingly, Dr. Nicole, that you said that, because I've heard from people who say, well, if you're organizing your team in a DevOps kind of way, you actually may wind up eliminating some of that middle management. Then I've heard other people say, oh no, au contraire, that middle management layer is imperative to facilitating communication between various team members and team to team and going on up the food chain, right? And so you don't eliminate middle management or, that mid-level stuff. Team, let me put it to you. What is the best team structure for DevOps success? Paul, you've dealt with it on multiple different organizations now where some of the other guys have been focused on just one. I'm interested in your experience.
Yeah, well, so one of the interesting things about my experience, and I'm lucky to have had this experience, is I've seen these transformations happen in small Bay Area startups, and then I've also worked with huge engineering teams, 2,000 engineers going through this transformation. And one of the interesting things to me about that experience is you'd be surprised at how often the things that we talk about are problems in 12-people startups, right? Because you have strong personalities and some of the dynamics that happen there you see in really large organizations. Because I've seen a lot of different organizations, I would say that I actually can't, I wouldn't pretend to know what the best, like there's one singular best team structure. I can tell you one thing that I've seen that repeatedly that is an anti-pattern, and it's I'll tell you kind of a funny story. I did some sort of intro to DevOps, kind of DevOps boot camp type training for a division of a relatively large company, and so we did this day-long training about trying to understand the 3 ways and some of the stuff in the Phoenix project and those types of things, just to give them an introduction to kind of what this stuff meant. And then I called the manager of that team, a couple weeks later, and they said, oh yeah, everybody really liked the training and they thought it was really useful, but it turns out that and this was a larger organization, they decided to centralize everything at a DevOps Center of Excellence at a different site that was miles away, and so everything that we learned we can sort of forget. And I've heard that there is among larger, medium to larger sized organizations, this sort of let's build a center of excellence, a DevOps center of excellence. And I've never really understood how that has ever worked. And honestly, I've never heard a case study where people have been, super enthused about it and say, oh, this really works, because you're taking all of that learning and all of those interactions that you want to have between potentially existing silos, and you're saying, well, we're going to centralize all of that work in some part of the organization, and it's we always joke about creating another silo like the DevOps team silo. It's like even worse than that, because it's this sort of ivory tower of DevOps architects, right? And so not only are you moving that knowledge and the work that teams go through in figuring out what DevOps means for them and what the DevOps patterns mean in their particular organizational and technological context, you're moving that all the way, and then also you're kind of separating them socially and organizationally from the larger system. So that one has never made sense to me, and you see it I've seen it happening less, but I still get that question a lot with big organizations. It's like, can you do DevOps without a DevOps team? And I'm like, yes, you probably actually should do DevOps without a DevOps team. So.
Yep.
Can I rebut that, Paul? I'm sorry, very quickly. So I agree with what you said, Paul, but I would not discourage communities of practice. So I think the idea of learning from other teams is really important as you scale.
Oh, I totally agree. I think learning from teams, other teams in the system is really important, but I think that should be sort of a level playing field of cross-pollination. And every time I've seen that, it's we're going to have a bunch of, an ops architect and a development architect and whatever, and they're going to go over and into this separate organization that's 100 miles away at headquarters, and then they're going to dictate to the teams what DevOps means, and I just think that's a huge lost opportunity, because that's not really cross-pollination at all. That's command and control of your DevOps strategy, which, I've never seen that work.
Interesting.
Yeah, Jay Paul, I 100% agree with you. I think the Center of Excellence kind of anti-pattern that saw some success, in the early days of IT kind of gets stamped out in a lot of these orgs, and then actually prevents learning, and it actually creates, obvious bottlenecks, because you're always waiting on that central group, but then that central group is the only one that understands a certain concern, whether it's, in this case, you're talking about, DevOps itself, but in other concerns you may have DBAs or you may have SAs, that only those resources understand those technical concerns, and then that kind of creates a blindness on other teams to be enabled. And so one of the things that we're continuing to try to do is move more to centers of enablement that share kind of community of practice and tools, almost like an open source model. And that one shares the learning, but it also removes those bottlenecks of always waiting on another group to do work for you, as opposed to being able to really kind of help yourself do the work.
Right, and you want to bring that context. You want to bring sort of the DevOps patterns that we know work. It's really important to bring that as close as you can to the localized context of the work that people are doing. And so to the other point about centers of excellence, one of the great models that I've seen that sounds like that, but it's totally not, is Target and their dojo. Right, that's a great example of where it seems like it's a center of excellence, but what it really is bringing teams in, letting them have that experience, and then taking that experience back and being able to apply it to their context. And then they rotate teams through, so you actually get that cross-pollination. You almost fertilize that cross-pollination between the teams.
Interesting. Guys, let me, as I suspected, we're going to have a lively discussion. Before we go on to our next slide, I wanted to just hit this last point on the slide, which is, what do you think is the most important metric when measuring DevOps success? And Dr. Nicole, I'm going to throw that one at you.
I have thoughts. Yeah, I definitely have thoughts on that, right? It's a metrics question. So anytime we're measuring success, you always want to be looking at your outcome metric, right? What is success? And what does it mean to the team? So when we're talking about DevOps, we always want to be delivering value. So take a look at what value means and what success means to that group. So who's your end user? Who is your customer? What is your outcome? So many times you're going to be looking at something like IT performance, right? So are you able to deliver code both with speed and stability? Are you able to make an impact and be successful to your end users and your customers? So if those end users and customers are external, are you driving value to your external customers? But even if your customers are internal to the business, are you driving value to those internal customers? Make sure you identify some type of metric that helps you capture some type of value that resonates with those users. And Sam said something last year that was really fantastic, and he said it so succinctly that I totally dug it and I wrote it down. I scratched something out. I'm pretty sure I tweeted it. And it was if you only capture one metric, you know exactly what is going to be gained, right? So you also want to make sure that you have 2 or 3 metrics that are sort of in tension with each other so that you're not only paying attention to one thing, because if you do that, like we all know this, right? This is another thing I sort of talk about is that metrics end up being culture, because anything that you measure, even if you say that we're just keeping track of it and this isn't incentivized, this is just a thing that we're paying attention to, it always ends up informing and being reinforced and turning into something that people pay attention to. So it changes our behavior, and that ends up like changing the way that we do our work, and it changes the things that we pay attention to. So make sure you pay attention to 2 or 3 things that are important in your outcomes, and they aren't things that are easily gamed and easily automated and easily changed, right? So if we think about like, you know, tickets are an easy example, right? If it's something like we respond to our tickets quickly, well, that's going to be easy, right? You can automate a system that like auto responds or auto closes a ticket, right? So make sure you have outcomes that are meaningful.
Excellent. Guys, we
May
could
I,
probably...
may I comment on this, Ellen? So,
Of course, Sam, how can I deny you? Of course, go ahead.
So I agree with everything Nicole said about that you focus on customer value. Something that I think is not always looked at is the time to validated learning. If you believe that one of the great benefits of DevOps is that you can quickly experiment and you can quickly determine which of your experiments gets the desired result, which doesn't get the desired result, which is indifferent, then the sooner you can double down on the ones that are working and the sooner you can fail fast on the ones that aren't, the better off you are. And if you think about that as accumulating validated learning, and you think about it as how quickly can we run the experiments that yield validated learning and how quickly can we accumulate the learning, then you have a way of thinking about this in terms of both external and internal value.
Yes.
It is not, it's not a way that everyone does it, and it's sort of a compound of several other things, and I would never say focus on a single metric. But that's one that I think is often overlooked.
Well,
Excellent.
and yeah, and if I can kind of add on that just a little bit, if we even think about what does value mean, right? What is success? And build a culture that values that, right? So if we even take a look at what Microsoft has done here, right? Like Ronnie Kohavi came in and introduced this culture of experimentation and learning. And if you look at Microsoft, right? Microsoft has been playing their game for years and years and years, right? They're very, very, very good at what they do. We all think that we know what is going to build value. We all think that we know what our customer wants. Turns out we suck at it, right? We just aren't very good. And so, you know, exactly what Sam said, right? Build that culture, understand what success looks like or what we think success is going to look like, capture that learning quickly. So Ronnie Kohavi's experimentation platform, they build that out at Microsoft, which is an environment that should understand and likely understands their customer the very best. Only 1/3 of features that they expected to deliver value actually did. So, you know, think about your own platform, your own features, your own things that you're delivering to your own customers. Our own hit rates are probably not better than 50%. So, absolutely.
Good point. Guys, we need to hop over to the next theme. And before we do, just for our audience, we're following along. If you're following along at Twitter, it's hashtag DOES16, DOES16. You can ask questions via Twitter. We'll try to get them in. Speaking of questions, I remind you, if you have questions, please put them in the question section so that we can get to them at the appropriate time. Let's now pop on to our next theme of this year's DOES Enterprise Summit, or DevOps Enterprise Summit, San Francisco, and that is one of people and culture. And, you know, this is, to me, this is really the hidden tiger of DevOps, right? So many people, when I talk to with DevOps, get into tools and so forth, and it's not, you know, tools are important. I'm not poo-pooing it, but it is a people and culture type of situation. And, you know, we've heard, how does an enterprise, is one of the first things here, how do enterprises establish new cultural norms as part of a DevOps transformation effort? And let me put that another way. How do we kickstart this? I'm a leader. I want to get my team DevOps, you know, moving in a DevOps manner. Or I'm not the leader, but how do I convince them? How do we go about doing this at our place? Guys, who wants to, Scott, you haven't had a chance to talk enough. So we're going to let
sure.
kick off.
So I think definitely one of the hardest things to do is to change the culture, right? Especially for organizations that have had established silos for many years. And that's been one of our challenges, right? Because when you have folks that kind of learn vertically of how to do one role, they generally tend not to be experimenters. And so it takes a lot of strong leadership and often different types of people to actually change kind of that thought process, and to have people that will begin to experiment or challenge kind of outside of their traditional boundaries that they have been, you know, encased in for such a long time.
Excellent. Sam, any thoughts on
Sure.
that? How do?
Sure. We have something we call live site culture. The idea of live site culture is that you have a set of priorities. It's a you build it, you run it culture. So everyone in engineering takes rotation effectively on call. That doesn't mean you're always doing it. It means you're doing it maybe, you know, 1 week in 8 or something like that. And your first priority is, your priorities are in order: time to detect, time to mitigate, and time to root cause repair. In other words, you want to be sure if there is something adversely affecting any customer, you detect it as quickly as possible. And, you know, the goal here is split second. You want to be able to mitigate it for that customer or that group of customers as quickly as possible. And then you want to be able to take the actions that are necessary in order to prevent a future recurrence. That's the root cause repair. And we practice this, we track it, we track not only the times and our success, but how we do with aging of items so that we don't have stuff that's sitting on the backlog not getting attended to. We think that's all key across the team, and we think that that is a common engineering view that we need to have. We've collapsed career ladders, so there's one engineering career ladder instead of multiples, and we practice this broadly and very visibly.
Excellent.
So I would actually note one thing. It's kind of interesting when people say that it's hard to change the culture. I actually don't know that I agree that it's hard to change the culture, with a little bit of nuance. And what I mean by that is it takes a long time to change the culture, and it takes a concerted effort to change the culture, and it can involve a lot of, you know, things that are uncomfortable, like looking at long-standing incentives that the organization has made, or, you know, what gets rewarded, what gets, you know, gets you in trouble. Those things, though, aren't particularly hard. It's just a lot of times it's hard to get on board to do that for the 2 years and consistently do that for the 2 years or however long it's going to take. That part is hard. The actual sort of mechanics of it, I think, aren't super difficult. You know, one of the really funny, fascinating stories is, you know, about the andon cord, right, from the Toyota production system, about, you know, people stopping the line, and this story about, I think it was GM that brought it over to the States. And when somebody stopped the line in the States, you know, the manager went over and yelled at them, right? And I think that's an example of when you're trying to do cultural change, you know, taking these concepts and porting them without sort of understanding all of that stuff can be problematic. And so that part maybe is hard. But I mean, the mechanics of it, the hard part is sticking with it. And I've seen that repeatedly in case studies and with clients. The hard part is just, you know, eating your vegetables, if you will.
Sure.
Yeah, and,
So
and maybe even, if can I add one more thing?
good.
Doing the right hard thing, right? Like there's many times in difficult, can I call them difficult cultures, there's generally like one or two people that are like the jerks, right, or the a-holes that everybody kind of knows. But many times people just sort of put up with them because they're like, oh, but they do really good work. Like everyone knows they're super, super toxic, but they do really good work. And everyone sort of knows that like they sort of need fired. And it's really hard. Like oftentimes people will keep them around an extra year or even 2 years, even though they know they're sort of destroying the culture and they're sort of super toxic.
It's not sort of, Nicole. I will tell you as an entrepreneur, sort of.
Right?
Not sort of. And
I
I've
keep
learned
saying the
this
word
lesson
sort of.
the hard way. Yeah, I've learned this the hard way. If someone is malignant in your organization, cut the malignancy out. The longer you wait to cut that malignancy out, the more it spreads and infects others.
Right.
So
This is
So-
this is no brilliant jerks, right?
Right. Like doing the right hard thing is hard, right? Because like you sit back and you're like, oh, but they've done so much good. They've helped
you got to
the
bite the
culture out so
bullet.
long. Like you just got to do the thing. And it's like admittedly it's hard to do that. It's hard to do the right hard thing. But if you can just like do it and then go, it really makes it so it's like airing out a room, right? Like the spring cleaning, right? Like you clean the thing, you open the windows, you air it out. That's actually one of the things that really helps the most.
Yep, it's cutting off a limb to save the body. But
I'd agree with that. I'd also say you want to model the right behavior.
Yes, absolutely. And it's hard to model the right behavior when you keep tolerating toxicity.
well,
Agreed.
it makes you hypocritical. Let me move into talent trends here, though. Do you think
Which is a perfect segue, because you know what? If you really think you have to tolerate bad people because they do good work, no, absolutely not, because you know what? Everyone else can do good work. Everyone else can learn and grow and develop, even if you say that you can't hire engineers because right now like the hiring thing is super hard and everyone's going to say it's super impossible. Well, you know what? You can develop your own talent because people are amazing and people are smart.
Yeah. And guys, that was really where I wanted to hit on this one, which is rather than going out, I appreciate it. You know, so at DevOps.com, I get inundated from recruiters who are saying, "Oh, we have all these DevOps engineer specs open. We need DevOps people." And I'm like, well, don't they already have developers and ops people there, admins there? Can't you just, you know, get them to become DevOps people? And well,
When I see that, I was going to say, specifically when I see that where it's like, we need DevOps people, and there's a bunch of open recs, you can talk to them for 5 or 10 minutes, and the answer is, yeah, we want that, we just don't want to pay for it. So I'm of the mind that you can cultivate the talent or you can hire it in externally. You can go both routes. But when you see this thing where it's like, we really want DevOps people, but we just have trouble hiring them, it's like you'll look at sort of where they are in the market, and it's often an issue there. And for organizations that maybe don't have a lot of flexibility on that, that is where, you know, taking the time and effort to develop the talent internally is oddly isn't a thing that they sort of seem to come up with on their own, but it's totally a solution to that problem.
And that's the best solution.
Yeah.
And also, keep your people so they don't leave, because
absolutely
hiring and retention, I mean, hiring new people costs you 10 times as much as...
Yeah, and you know what, with all due respect, you guys are in San Francisco and Seattle and you know, tech towns, if you will. Here in South Florida, where I'm based, for instance, it's near impossible to find a DevOps engineer, even if you are paying top dollar. You just don't see that many. You're much better off putting the time into developing your people. But let's talk a little bit, and we really only have a minute or two. What skills are needed for a DevOps future, as it says here? What are the chief skills? Scott, again, I'm going to pick on you if you don't mind. What skills do you think we should look for?
So a couple things, and I'll carry with what Nicole and J. Paul were talking about is it does take time, and I appreciate the feedback on it being hard. More a factor of it takes time to kind of transition the culture, and so one of the things that we have been cultivating really kind of on cross-functional teams is educating and then training folks how to carry out these other skills. So traditionally, a lot of operations has been kind of activity-oriented and very strong at those activities, but not necessarily engineering-oriented. So what we've been looking for is basically operational engineers who are now willing to kind of step up and actually truly become engineers and really kind of go to the next level and start doing development activities, use things like version control, learn those engineering practices of good code management, writing tests when you check in your code, using things like CI and kind of automated deployment. So those are really some of those skills that I see you can grow on your current talent, and it's really important to do that because, as Nicole referenced, it's really hard to hire a lot of folks from the outside and kind of bring that in and then really learn all the rest of the norms that they have to then kind of get in place and your domain. Both those things are difficult to do.
Can I add one thing here?
Sure.
If you're super short on funds and people and everything, what you can sometimes do, one strategy that works, is find one really solid person. Either you have them in-house already or you can hire one and have that one person help model and train behavior. Right?
Yeah,
like
that's fantastic. And we use that model, the exemplar, for kind of the behavior that you want to model, and then inject them into these different areas where you see the gaps.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And I would point out too, I mean, to that point, the bit about cultural change taking a long time. One of the real big, it's almost a painful mistake to watch is that organizations will work on developing their talent internally, and they'll start on this DevOps transformation and they'll work really hard at it. They're doing really good work, and then something for some reason backslides, and for whatever reason they don't completely make the transformation and they start falling back into old patterns, and all the people that they've invested in are like, I don't want to go back to the old way of working, and they leave. I've seen that happen. And that is just painful to watch because it's like you get the worst of both those situations. You invested and then you backslid and they leave. And that's really hard.
That's a great observation, Paul, and that's why you need a growth mindset which rewards everything as a learning opportunity. So the notion is not, oh, we failed, we need to stop. The notion is, something didn't happen as we expected, so we need to learn from it.
Yep.
And what is the validated learning here?
And that's such a life lesson in general right there, Sam. But with that said, let us move on to our next big theme. And again, while we're loading, remind our listeners, if you have questions, as you can tell, our panel loves to answer questions. Please type them into the question section of your GoToWebinar control panel, and we will get to them in about another 10 or 15 or so minutes. But our next theme, major theme for DevOps Enterprise Summit San Francisco next week, process and technology, right? And why don't we start off with, sometimes people say, oh, that sounds very sort of highfalutin, but what do we mean by process and technology? And Sam, would you like to take a crack at kind of defining that for the audience?
Sure. So one of the things we historically have done is focus on the resulting product. One of the things that we learn in DevOps is to focus on the creating process. The reason for that is we're not delivering something once and then leaving it in market for years, but we're delivering continually. So you need a rugged process and a clear process that allows you to make many updates. Indeed, the mind shift here is from thinking about delivering a widget and minimizing the mean time between failure for the many copies of that widget to thinking about the mean time to mitigate and the mean time to remediate for a continual flow of value that you're delivering. So what you see in good DevOps companies is that they are deploying continually, they are deploying with exposure control so that they can measure the effectiveness and minimize the blast radius and redeploy if needed. And they're thinking in terms of speed. And that speed means that you're not, whatever you're delivering this minute is not the same thing necessarily that will be there in an hour or a day or a week. So you need the process, and that process needs to be supported by suitable technology that you can continually deliver at quality and continually deliver with very high visibility of everything that is happening in production, so that you know exactly when to persevere and when to pivot.
Excellent. So, you know, Nicole, Damon Edwards and John Willis did a presentation in London over the summer at Does London. And it was basically the iron triangle, right? How DevOps can help you go faster, better, and cheaper, right? And I think sort of our first point on this slide hits two of the three of those, which is, does DevOps really improve software quality and efficiency? So can we go faster at higher quality? And how exactly does DevOps do that? You want to kind of take a stab at it?
Sure. So we really do see this over, you know, at least all the data that I've seen over the last several years is that, you know, for years at least, we've been told or it's been suggested and like whispered in our ears that if we want to be stable in our code, right, if we want our platforms and our infrastructure and the code that we deliver to be stable, we kind of have to slow down a little bit. Turns out the highest performers, the people that are doing the best at this, they aren't slowing down, right? They're getting both throughput, they're getting speed, and they're getting stability. And this is across, you know, 25,000 data points around the world through all industry verticals, right? So we're seeing both. And then in this last year's data set, and by the way, this is all coming from the State of DevOps reports, and a couple of years of this has also appeared in academic peer review as well. So, and in this last year's data set, we also included some additional measures of quality as well. So we included things like escape defects. We included the amount of rework that appears. We also include unplanned rework. We also included things like security incidents that are found late, very, very late, and it looks like, you know, all of these things all go together. So by having these solid DevOps processes where, and by that I mean having, you know, sound technical practices that, you know, Sam and Paul and Scott have all talked about, you know, version control, fast feedback loops, you know, things that, you know, other things that we know are good practices like trunk-based development, deployment, automated deployment, test automation, having strong technical practices, having good process and lead management practices as well with good visualization through the chains, having a strong culture as well where we treat everything as a learning opportunity. These types of things really predict and contribute to and drive and support this strong IT performance with strong quality. And, you know, we see it in the data, and we're seeing it in the data year over year over year. And it's not even just consistently year over year, but we're seeing drastic improvements year over year. I mean, it's sort of like, you know, like the tortoise and the hare, right? It's not like you can just win and then hang out and stay put. All of the best performers are continuing to get better and better and better. And it's really an exciting time to be in technology.
Absolutely. I say that all the time to people. Let me get to the third bullet point here, because it's something that I find really interesting, and that is, what modern technology trends do enterprise IT and software development organizations need to keep in mind heading into 2017? And Scott, why don't we start with you on that one?
Well, there's so many exciting ones. It's hard to kind of narrow that down, and I think it definitely depends on the scope of the things that you are trying to solve as a company. For us, a lot of the trends, really revolve around things like infrastructure as code and getting that across, and the private cloud or platform as a service components, and getting that really across teams that are really used to doing a lot of things by, kind of with tasks. I know those aren't, incredibly innovative, trending like, some of the big data technologies and Docker and those things today, but those are key things that I think a lot of traditional organizations still need to get in place, and then get those software development practices in place around their infrastructure, because you can really drive down lead time and drive up the quality around the things that you deliver.
Paul, what about you?
I think one of the big trends in 2017 that is going to be a really big deal, well, it already is a big deal, but is security and how we do security. I mean, we just saw, a botnet of the Internet of Things take down some core Internet infrastructure in a pretty serious way. And so, I know that security is already on the mind of enterprise IT orgs. They're really concerned about it. I think the interesting bit with the DevOps part is, and sort of DevOps initiatives, is that the thing that we're realizing is that you can integrate security, and you can do it in a pretty sustainable way that actually doesn't gate things, doesn't put in these blockages in the value stream and the delivery of value. And there's some case studies of organizations that are doing that in really sustainable ways that improves their security posture. So I think the big thing is going to be realizing that it's not like the people doing the security work, we need to bring them into that fold and get them into that value stream, and have them, become a part of the progress that's already been made on continuous delivery pipelines and things like that.
Sure. We're going to have more on that in just a second, Scott. Paul, because, our next slide deals a little bit with compliance and security. But let me throw one other trend out at you guys and just quickly
can I jump in? I have an idea.
Go ahead.
Before you scoop me.
I wouldn't scoop you.
I think APIs are going to start to be a bigger deal.
Absolutely.
And I would say, I second that. I would also say, since no one's brought it up, mobile DevOps is something that we need to start.
Oh, yeah.
Everyone's doing multi-channel apps and reaching out to mobile. Today, you have split pipelines for service side and device side, and yet you really want to understand user interaction end to end.
Sure. And you know what, Sam, in that vein, you might have scooped me, but not 100%. I think a trend that enterprise IT and software development organizations need to keep in mind is the sense of entitlement of end users, right? And I don't know if it's a millennial thing, though I'm as guilty of it, and I'm certainly no millennial. But you know what? If I can't get my internet at 33,000 feet on the plane, or if an app is down, or if I experience any downtime, or there's a bug, or there's, a new update comes and it messes with one of my favorite features that were there, my tolerance is so low because I expect so much.
Hey, ADHD is the new normal.
So that's one thing that I see, with the proliferation of continuous delivery, because there is this sort of, hey, continuous delivery is really great, let's do that, and they don't do any of to go back to the eating your vegetables or working out, they don't do any of the work to make that a good experience, so they really get into, let's just ship garbage more quickly. And so you do see this, like,
burn people up in the meantime. It's brute force.
Let's burn people up, and also our customers aren't happy because, I mean, we've all had this experience where some app updates on our phone and that favorite feature doesn't work, and then we're just like, well, great, right? I didn't want this, and now everything's broken, right? And you can get, depending on the feature, bad press about that. So the thing is, and I was sort of actually going to mention that from a technology trend, you see a lot of organizations, this is one of my favorite examples, they say, I want continuous delivery, I want continuous delivery. And then you point out, well, do you have any continuous integration? They're like, I don't know what that is, but I don't want it. I want continuous delivery. And you have to have a conversation. It's like, you got to do the continuous integration first, right? So there are a lot of these things where it's kind of funny. You say the millennials, and I'm maybe a millennial, depending on how you want to count it. They want these things, and you're right. But I also think that they want it, but without some of the common breakages that we see now.
Yeah. Absolutely. Guys, we need to move along, though I'd love to jump in on that for a full hour. Our next slide, as I mentioned earlier, deals with compliance and security, and that is another major theme at this year's DevOps Enterprise Summit San Francisco. So who was it? I believe, was it Sam or Paul brought up security as a major trend to be jumping on?
Well, I mentioned it, and like I said, I know that it's kind of an interesting, it's a big deal. I find
Kind of a big deal.
Yeah, kind of a big deal, it turns out. I find it interesting, actually, that compliance and security kind of have globbed together. Or I don't know if they naturally have done that or we kind of did that.
No, it's bastardized. So like Gene, I haven't got 12
Someone in
years
marketing kind of threw them together.
Well, no, but
No, it wasn't marketing. It wasn't marketing. I'll tell you what it was. The security industry for too long was like selling insurance, right? Our best customers were the people who already died. And we thought we grabbed, and I mean I was part of it, we grabbed onto compliance because it was a way for people to get a gun to their head and say, oh, you need security because otherwise you could go to jail, you'll fail your audit, all of these bad things will happen to you.
Well, that was a joke anyway. I mean,
That's totally marketing.
Yeah, so I think the pivot point was when Target's CEO got fired after the
Oh, it was way before then, but that was a high watermark for the security industry.
So
Yeah.
my point is that's when people started thinking differently about security. Until then, security was, all about building higher fortress walls and making them more impregnable and what have you. And what was really clear in the Target breach and what subsequently in the Sony breach and subsequently with the U.S. government.
The second and third and fourth and fifth Sony breach.
Yeah, exactly. You have to assume breach. You cannot assume that your perimeter defenses are sufficient to keep the bad actors out. You have to provide defense in depth so that you can identify whether there are breaches already in place, because there are these very circuitous routes that are found by the attackers through reconnaissance. It was 6 months of reconnaissance for Target, for example, and they came in through an HVAC contractor and threaded their way laterally into the point-of-sale system and so forth. The ideas that of the past where you said, hey, security is build that stronger perimeter defense, that's just not sufficient. You need to...
Well, the cloud blows that out, Sam, right? You can't build a moat and castle, which is what you're talking about, right? I'm going to build a bigger moat.
Can't only be a pen test, right?
Yeah,
right.
that doesn't work.
The great thing about the cloud and the great thing about DevOps is that you can continually refresh the infrastructure so that the bad actors have no place in your network to hide.
So,
and
go ahead. No, I was going to say, so Sam, you hit on a couple of things that we talk a lot about in security, one of which is this idea of preventative security versus reactive security, right? And you can't put all your chips on either pile, right? You can't just bet black or red here. You got to bet a little black and bet a little red and cover all your bases. But on top of that, what you need, and I think what DevOps in the cloud gives us, is resilient infrastructure, right? Where we can adapt to events in real time based upon threat intelligence and analysis, and we have the ability to use the cloud, to use DevOps type of functionality to to move around our pieces, if you will. I don't know if you ever make yourself totally secure or even totally compliant for that matter, but
Well,
you can.
you
Go ahead.
cannot make yourself totally secure. So
Right.
you have to make yourself totally fast as well.
Mhm.
And if you have, if you work on the principle that your infrastructure is dynamic, then you don't provide places to hide and you can move faster. I'm not suggesting that security should be reactive instead of proactive. I think it should be as proactive as you can make it. But the proaction is in the process. It's, again, it goes back to this notion that you want a process that is fast, that allows you to detect in split seconds, that allows you to mitigate immediately, that allows you to...
Or even if you can't detect, refresh your apps, refresh your infrastructure, refresh everything so that you effectively overwrite what they've taken over.
Yeah,
Exactly.
and Sam, I think you hit on one of the things when you talked about kind of the process, but I also think it's important to say that that process has to be engineered because that gives us the speed. And
Yes.
then if you kind of look at this whole concept of shifting left, it's really important because there used to be practice kind of a lot of duct tape engineering where you hand the software over to an ops group and they go run it and they try to secure it by layering 30 tools on top. It's pretty hard to make that sustainable, but when you engineer it into the pipeline, then you can move very quickly and then you can adapt to threats, to changes. When the next Heartbleed comes out, now I can patch the several hundred servers that need to get updated. And that shifting left and not duct tape engineering things is pretty vital to do that. It's pretty funny. We were looking at a very popular, doing a larger rollout of a very popular config management tool. And we invited the security team to the review, and they, in the beginning of the meeting, they're like, security never gets invited. You guys are talking about integrating policy into pipelines so that it's done up front, and they were just like, this is amazing.
Well,
they usually come along after the fact and have to figure out how to secure something after it's been released.
and to sort of come, well, to sort of come full circle to what we were talking about of why compliance shows up. That's the thing. I don't know that I buy that it was a marketing thing from the standpoint of that when you have that, to get that speed, you have to use a configuration management tool or some orchestration to get that to even work from a security perspective. And then somebody said, well, hey, if we have to document all that in code anyway, why couldn't we use that for the compliance stuff? And so there's this natural sort of leveraging that stuff that you had to do already to get actual compliance visibility. And I've been on some audits and I've seen some audits, and the secret that nobody likes to talk about is like audits are totally like a goat rodeo, and it's a bunch of people signing that they did something whether or not they actually did that thing. And now we have tools that can assert that, and that's great. That's why that stuff.
Well, because auditors love automation. I mean, and that's a whole other thing. Guys, I need to move us along. I apologize but we need to. We've got.
Can I say one thing super fast?
Go ahead, super fast.
So sometimes people say shifting left on security is going to slow down your code delivery because like now you put the super slow security people at the front of the train instead of at the back of the train. So we added it in the study last year and it totally speeds everything up. So anyone who's sitting there super skeptical, it doesn't. And like we've got guidance in there, it totally helps. And it reduces the security incidents that are escaped that need remediated. So it helps all around.
It helps all. Guys, RSA this year, I'm doing our Rugged DevOps DevSecOps Day on Monday. Come to it. We're going to discuss all of this in addition to what's going on at DUDS. So looking ahead at DUDS, we're not going to get a chance to jump into these questions, but I hope everyone on here, if you're not attending, the good news is that there are, I believe, some tickets left. They're nearly sold out. I really, if you guys can, if you're in San Francisco, it's a no-brainer, but even if you're not, if you're into DevOps and you enjoyed some of the discussions today, please, please, please go check it out. And everyone gets a copy of the DevOps Handbook as well. And last but not least, before we jump into questions, if you're going to DUDS and you don't live in California, vote early, vote This is an important election. Please vote. Can't stress it enough. I live in Florida. I voted already. But let's jump into some questions, guys. So, our first question from Ramesh Reddy. In larger enterprises where we have teams structured as IT application ops, infrastructure, engineering, and architecture, how do you envision DevOps in such a large enterprise? I think a bunch of us have dealt with this. Who wants to take it?
Well, so I work on a team that has about 60,000 internal customers.
That's large.
And we have literally removed career stage profiles in the HR system so that people think of themselves as engineers and don't think of themselves as specialists in terms of their career advancement. They certainly have specialization, and we certainly cherish their skills. Someone may be outstanding at everything SQL related or everything NoSQL related or everything performance or telemetry related, but they are not rated on a separate career ladder than others. And the notion of collective ownership and accountability at the level of the feature crew is something that we now have widespread throughout the org.
Great. Next question. I think we might have answered this one, but just in case. Does delivering features faster with higher quality with DevOps cost more or less than traditional approaches? Nicole, that sounds like a great question for you.
Well, first, I'm going to say that's the wrong question, because it should not be about saving money. It should be about delivering value, because if you're delivering value, you're going to make more money hand over fist, and then the differential in cost just doesn't matter. And it ends up costing about the same or less, and then you end up making way more money.
Excellent.
Guys, I will say one quick thing. I oftentimes with that you see in certain ways, depending on how you measure it, I'm sure Nicole has seen this too, it seems like it costs more upfront, but that's because
upfront.
all of that at the back end, nobody's accounting for that. And so if you were to actually look at the value stream from a budgeting perspective, you would see it's actually either the same or cheaper.
Right. And like initially sometimes you have to make a quick or an initial investment in technology, and so suddenly you're shining a light on things that you just, as Paul said, like that you weren't really measuring before, you weren't capturing before.
Excellent. Guys, we're 1 minute past the hour. I need to call it a day. Everyone, thank you for joining us today. Nicole, Dr. Nicole, Sam, Paul, Scott, thank you for giving of your time. Looking forward to seeing all of you present next week at DOES. And for our audience, if you are attending DOES and you've been on the webinar, I'll be doing video there. Please stop by, say hello, introduce yourself. I'd love to hear what you thought of the webinar. But until next week then, we're going to call it a day. This is Alan Schimmel, Editor-in-Chief, DevOps.com. Thanks for joining us on today's webinar. Thanks to IT Revolution for sponsoring it and making it happen. Again, thanks to our panelists, thanks to our attendees. Guys, we'll see you next week at DOES. Don't miss it. Have a great day, everyone.